Hey guys, in this video, I'm going to be going over the process for this piece that I've done right here. Usually when I start off with a piece, I try and set out an intention. So that can be a bunch of different things, whether it's a specific skill that you want to learn, to something where it's a little bit more of a habit building thing, or maybe it's to address certain mindsets that you have, or even building up discipline. In my case, I've just been doing a lot of these paintings on Procreate as a way to relax after work, or sometimes I do it as a warm-up before work. And since I've been doing these for quite a while, and usually what I do is that I choose something on Pinterest, something that catches my eye, and I do a more direct copy of it. However, for this piece, I wanted to try to push that a little bit further. And I think that's really important when it comes to doing studies. I'm sure a lot of us have experienced doing a lot of studies, but then feeling like it doesn't really get us anywhere. It's not that the studies themselves can't give you any improvements at all, but I do think you hit a certain ceiling when you mindlessly approach it. You get to a certain point where your newbie gains are gone, and you just feel like you're doing the same thing over and over again and seeing minimal returns from it. And one of the most important things to do, in my opinion, is to set a key intention on what skills you want to learn from your piece, but also on top of that as well, making sure that you apply it so you don't just go on autopilot and not absorb as much as you could be doing. So in my case, I'll show you guys the reference images that I found on Pinterest that caught my eye, which is the one over here. And the main reason why I chose this one is because I like the composition. It's a very nice and simple one. You see an architecture in the foreground, and you see another one further in the background. And I do like the setting as well. It's very lush, very peaceful. However, one of the things that I didn't quite like about it is the lighting and the mood. So even when you're choosing reference, it doesn't mean that it has everything that you want. You would be lucky to find something that has the composition, the lighting, the mood, the design language that addresses everything. So sometimes what you end up doing is mixing and matching. So when it came to the mood and lighting, I found that this one was far more interesting for me to study. It's a backlit lighting scenario, and because of all of the atmosphere in the air, whether it's from humidity, whether it's from smoke, it creates this nice haziness in the background. It's not something that I typically do. I usually go for a more clear, sunny day kind of vibe. So I thought this would be really interesting. And rather than just doing the same architecture that's in the original reference, I thought it would be far more interesting if I tried to design my own. And this is where this prop came to my attention. You'll notice that it's not an architecture, and that's fine. In fact, if you do another architecture and you put it in the scene, it might feel a little bit generic because you are just replicating another person's design. However, when you decide to try to create an architecture design from something that comes from an unlikely source, that's where you're able to come up with something that's unexpected and more unique. And these were the intentions for this study that I've set for myself, is to try out using a base composition, which is this one, changing up the mood to something like this, but also at the same time trying to push the design as well. If you're a beginner, I don't recommend trying to do too many things of these at once. Think about it this way. If you're a beginner, you would be best served being more on training wheels. So if you are going to do a study of this piece, maybe do it as it is, but keeping in mind what you're exactly focusing on, whether it's composition or whether it comes to the lighting of the scene or the mood, or maybe even the architecture design. Or you can at least try to change it up a slight bit. So one of the things that you can do, for example, is so you are changing it up, but not to the point that you're causing yourself so much stress trying to come up with a new design. Just changing it up about 10-20%. In fact, you don't even have to introduce a new architecture design. You can even just change this up slightly, or just change this composition up a bit slightly, where maybe you have a tower that comes up here when you're doing your own application of the study. So you can always do one study for yourself first, where you're not changing it up much at all, and then another one where you're applying the piece. Then maybe adding more foliage a little bit. And as you can see, it's slight changes. You probably changed it around 5 to 10% in this case. And that's fine. It's just enough for you to begin engaging yourself in the process, that you're going to think a little bit about, okay, how do I actually make this design fit with the rest of the scene? And you're going to look for context clues within other parts of the images and try to apply and replicate it. So in this case, I see this as matching. And when you become more confident, you can change up the variables a little bit more. Like I said, maybe you can try a different composition. You can try out a different mood in this case, and try out even making your own architecture design. And that all comes with more experience. And I do have a reference image of an artist that I really like called Ovopack, one of my favorite artists for a bunch of different reasons. They have a great sense of character design, creature design, can do both line work, tells very compelling stories, even in small illustrations. They can paint as well. So they basically have the whole package, and a lot of what I try to aim for in my own work. But this was not an image that I brought in initially. It's only something that I brought on near the end when I introduced the character into the scene. And you can probably see the resemblance over here. And that's something that is important to know, is that whenever you do a piece or study, it's okay to go back to Pinterest, Google search, whatever it is you find your reference images, and try to find solutions for the problems that you're having. Maybe you're struggling with the lighting, maybe you're struggling with the texture, etc., etc. You find those direct solutions after doing it. You don't always have to have all the answers ahead of time. In fact, sometimes I think it can be a very good practice and exercise for you to just start off with lesser reference. In this case, you can see that I basically have 3 pieces of reference and trying to get the most out of it. I think some of us also know that having too much reference can end up becoming overwhelming. And my analogy when it comes to this is that imagine you're cooking a dish. Sometimes it's better to focus on bringing out the quality of the few ingredients that you have, but of course ensuring that you have high quality ingredients, making sure that it addresses the intention and purpose of the piece that you're making. But of course later on, if you feel like something's lacking, then bring something in. And I feel that way you're able to keep your design purer and just much more clear in terms of the intention and the purpose. If you have too much, continuing that analogy, it ends up feeling like your dish becomes overwhelming in flavor. Maybe it's in fact hard to tell what the individual components are. So yeah, simplicity I think is the key. And one of my favorite quotes is that simplicity is the greatest sophistication. Caveat to all of this is that it does come with experience too. Sometimes you're able to draw upon past experiences, having worked on different projects and briefs, that you know certain solutions that you don't need as many images. So if you are a beginner, experiment. Try using minimal reference. Maybe try having a lot more reference at first and all the parts in between. It's only then that you will know what your best working style is and how much reference that you generally need. For me, a lot of these Procreate pieces, I try to minimize it and learn to trust a little bit more of my initial instincts. Sometimes I do think that I focus way too much on trying hard. I'm a try hard when it comes to personal pieces, to the point that I stopped enjoying my personal work. Everything felt so stressful. I felt like I always had to do intense research and iteration in order to come up with a finished piece. However, I'm trying to go the opposite of that, where I'm trying to rehabilitate myself to trust my initial instincts. And once again, there can be value to both approaches. I do think when you're working a professional job, it's a very difficult brief that you're working on and you're working with a client. It's generally best to give them options. You don't just want to lock them into one thing. However, when it comes to personal piece, I do find it to be such a great way to fill in the gaps that you're lacking in when it comes to your professional work. In general, if you're finding yourself stressing out too much at work because you are not confident in finding solutions and you find that your solutions are generally quite generic, then maybe it'll be good practice for you for your personal piece to push that without as much pressure from a deadline from the client. And maybe something else that you could be struggling with is that, of course, it could be a technical skill. I struggle with composition, so I'm going to spend a lot more time focusing on composition in my own personal work. And the great thing about all of it is that you can decide just how stressful, how intense it can be. And in my case, I see a lot of my personal work now as a way of reconnecting with my enjoyment of drawing again. So as a result, I try not to stress myself too much, or at least try not to do pieces that will stress me out, which ends up happening most of the time. I do think that is my toxic trait, is that I end up making pieces that are increasingly more complex, feeling like I have to one-up myself. So sometimes it's good for me to try to establish a base and kind of plateau out a bit before establishing the next one and climbing to the next height. So now that we've gotten the reference out of the way, I like to show you guys the time lapse and just a little bit more of the process. So as you can see, I kept the composition quite close to the original reference image, and you already see me implementing the design language from the prop into the scene already. If you really look at it as well, the prop is pretty much like an architecture, and that's one of my favorite ways of finding inspiration for architecture design, is just look at furniture and small props essentially. But you'll notice that I changed up the silhouette, especially the roof, a little bit more, just to make it feel like an architecture, whereas before it was an open basket, and I moved the cloth part in the middle towards the top so it can pop out of the silhouette and actually become more readable. So once I've established the composition, I established the masks. And for the lighting, because with the mood and lighting reference, it's backlighting and it only constitutes a very small part of the image, I decide to paint in the majority of the image first, which is the shadows. So I try to paint everything as if it was overcast, where it's in a cloudy day. But even during a cloudy day, you're going to get darker shadows as well. That's where it's usually the interior of the architecture, the underside of the roof, the underside of the hut, and all of that. And even parts of the grass as well. You can see that there's darker patches as well. However, because it's overcast, there's not a super strong contrast between all of the values. That's when the lighting will come in later on to push that. And as you guys can see, as you go further back into the background, you're going to notice that the colors become more desaturated and the value range gets smaller and smaller. And even the brushstroke sizes, if you notice, like the patch of grass in the foreground, scale-wise is technically smaller than the hills in the background. However, the brushstroke in the foreground is much bigger, and then the strokes of the background is much smaller. And this is a way to convey depth, because ultimately what we're working with is a flat canvas. We're creating the illusion of depth. And even with the architecture, that's what's happening, right? You have a larger one in the foreground, but as you go further back, you see that the architecture gradually gets smaller in size on the canvas. In terms of scale, the architecture is all the same. It's just the size on the canvas itself, it gradually gets smaller as you go further back. And that's how you portray depth, essentially. And it can come across in all things besides just literal objects. It can be brushstroke sizes. So here I'm trying to just add in a little bit more detail. You can see that I've already defined the textures on the huts a little bit more. And then now I'm starting to define out a little bit more detail in the background to push the scale, so it gets increasingly smaller with the brushstroke sizes and detailing. And this is where the lighting come in. I believe I use a color dodge or linear dodge layer or an add layer in Procreate in order to add in this lighting. As you can see, I'm only doing it for a certain part. There's like just a sliver that's coming down the middle, lighting up the background architecture, the hill in the midground, but not the architecture in the foreground. Because the background and midground architecture are lit up, the ones in the foreground is actually the one that stands out. And that's because of contrast. In the same way, if you have most of the scene in shadow and you have one architecture in the light, that's what will stand out by virtue of contrast once again. So you can flip that on its head to try out a different way of creating a focal point. Because focal points essentially in the end are just novelty. It's just different from all the other patterns you've established in the scene. And here I'm trying to push the storytelling of the scene because it's by a lake. I thought maybe the tribe that lives here thrives off of the lake, whether it comes to fishing. Well, mainly fishing that I've done here, as I put the docks, I put baskets maybe filled with fish inside, then boats in the mid-ground architecture too. And I've even hinted that there's bones and jaws of what looks like a shark's on the architecture as well. So these are ways you can hint at a greater storytelling, or hints at that there's more that's happening in the scene beyond what we're looking at right now. And with the environment established, this is where I've learned my big lesson. You'll notice that I did not have this lizard man in the scene at all at the start. And I only thought about adding him in when I was nearly finished. Which is fine and all. I do think that there's some moments where adding in a character can be quite simple. But because of the complex nature and silhouette of this lizard man, with its big tail and spear and all of that, it ended up obscuring so much of the image that I found it hard to figure out where to place him. Even the scale as well, I did not initially anticipate that. And looking back, I quite like him in its current position, but as you can see, as I'm starting to mask the character out, it's covering up so much of the background and all the storytelling details that I put, that it ended up feeling like I was wasting all of the effort that I had put into the piece already. But of course, at this moment, it seems like I'm still blissfully unaware. And you'll notice that panic starts to set in when the size of the lizard man basically starts to fluctuate. But you can also see that I'm trying to push the storytelling a little bit more as well, with the headdress design of the lizard matching that of the architecture. And on top of that as well, putting the fish in the net, showing that he's come back from a big hunt. Looking back, I probably could have put in some fish in the baskets underneath the architecture too, to further cement that tie. But yeah, it's always good to even know about these things, or looking back at it in retrospective. And here I'm trying to add in some smoke as a way to push the composition. It creates these diagonals that point towards the architecture. And since most of the architecture is horizontal and vertical in terms of element, I thought that a diagonal would be a really good way to push different flow in the scene as well. Just make it more interesting. I'm adding an atmosphere in between just to separate out the architecture and different planes a little bit more. There we have it. And overall, I'm quite happy still. It was a bit of a breakthrough because previously in my studies and pieces, I haven't been adding in characters. I haven't been pushing my own design. So just to be able to get back into a habit or have that spark to create something that's a little bit more of my own means that this piece to me was a success. It fulfilled the intention that I had, which is learning to push my designs again and implementing a different mood as well. I think that the mood and lighting came out quite nice actually. However, looking back at it now, I can see that there's a really big tangent with the net and the foreground. Lizard still feels really awkward. It still feels very tacked on, but that's a lesson that I can move forward with. And that's why I think it's so important to do a lot of work. It's just so that you don't get so precious even if you mess up on one piece. You can always just see it as a lesson that you can carry forward and you'll be better for it. As long as you've learned something based on the intention that you've set for yourself, it's always going to be a win. It might not be your best piece yet that best displays all of the learning that you have accumulated so far, but that will be a matter of time. And that's something that I have to remind myself too, that we all can be guilty of beating ourselves up when something doesn't go exactly how it was planned. But I think as long as we stick to it, there will be a time when we hit that mark, when we make that piece. Finally, everything that I've been working towards is finally showing through here in a way that I'm happy with. Do hope that the insights that I've given to you on this video are things that you can implement into your own work as well. And maybe it'll give you a little bit of inspiration on how you can approach your studies as well. Because as I mentioned, I do think it's one of the most challenging things that I've also struggled with as a beginner. And even if you are someone that's more experienced, you might even feel that personal work stops being fun for you. So maybe this kind of approach can give you the inspiration to try to pick up the pen and try to reclaim some of that fun back in your art. And I'll be making more of these kinds of narrated time lapses as well, where I go through my thought process of the pieces that I've done, or maybe I'll even go back to some of my old projects and do a little bit of a retrospective and see what kind of lessons we can learn from them as well. If you'd love to see more of that kind of stuff, let me know down in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you've enjoyed what you've been seeing, and share it with someone else that you think will find it helpful as well. And I will be seeing you guys in the next video. Take care, everyone.